Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon to the folks that are online. We're going to jump right in. So AI is transforming the world. I think it's pretty obvious in all of the core notes and sessions that you've seen over the last couple of days. However, AI isn't anything without data. We are a data team, and data is what powers everything. Even more important, though, you don't have data without tooling, automation, and CICD. My name is Jacob Knightley. I'm the principal engineering manager of one of our internal analytics teams for Azure Data. So you can think about me as a developer on top of Fabric, not a developer of Fabric. I have with me Ali.
Yeah, I'm Ali, and many years in Power BI, Fabric, CICD, automation, embed, all this stuff.
Excellent. So let's set some foundation. What is Microsoft Fabric? Hopefully the folks that are here in the room and those online know what Fabric is, but let's start from the foundation. So Fabric at its core is a single platform for AI, storage, security, and governance with a bunch of different engines on top of that. You can think about that as data factory, so that's pipelines, data flows, analytics, Spark, data science, databases, SQL DB, Cosmos DB, real-time intelligence, Event House, Event Stream, and the tried and true Power BI. Now, the focus of today's conversation is around automation and CI/CD. There's quite a landscape today in the world of CI/CD and automation. We have Git integration, we have variable libraries, we have open source libraries, REST APIs, CLI, deployment pipelines. The list goes on, right? Probably a bit too much to cover in an hour. So let's narrow down our focus a little bit for today's conversation. Our goal is to talk about that developer scenario or a persona. We're going to talk about Git integration, Fabric REST APIs, CLI, variable library, and the Fabric CICD OSS library. So a common question that we get is, great, you've landed another tool. What does that mean to me? How is that different than the other tool that's already in market? So if we start at the foundation, you can think about this similar to like a network layer. The foundation is our REST APIs. Those are the things that are going to interact directly with the service. Now, the APIs themselves may not necessarily be the most friendly thing to interact with because we're talking about core APIs that are interacting with the service. Taking that one layer up is where we come into that abstraction layer. We can think about that as the SDKs and the CLI. That's where we start to humanize what we're talking about. So a common example is maybe you're calling an API that requires some sort of asynchronous operation. Interacting directly with those APIs means you need to do that for it. Interacting with the CLI means you call a single command, or the SDK, you call a single command, and we handle the lift for you. Now, taking that one step higher, we talk about high-level tools. High-level tools is where we're kind of narrowing down that focus, and it starts to get a little bit gray of, well, how is that different than an abstraction layer? The key there with a high-level tool is that there is a layer in between that foundation and the tool itself. So the scenarios that we're talking about, Terraform Provider, Fabric CICD OSS library, and Senpai Labs OSS libraries. Again, the focus is very narrow, so it is similar to a CLI, but we're solving for one thing, and we're doing it very well. I'm going to hand it actually over to Ali to chat a little bit about CLI.
Hi, so first thing, the CLI is GA. I am sure that you heard about it in the keynote, and which means that it's production ready. You can start using that in your production environment. And I want to touch about how we designed the CLI. So the Fabric, you can look at it as a hierarchy, which we have a tenant in the top level. Inside the tenant, we have workspaces and other elements like capacities and so on. And in the workspaces, we have the items, right? So we designed the commands this way. So you use just the file system commands that you are familiar with, like cd and ls and so on, to move between different hierarchy levels. And then you can also use commands like copy, for example, or move, to move items or to copy items between workspaces. We will see this in a demo. But file system commands is not enough, are not enough themselves. So we added more commands like import, export, get, set, and so on. We have two modes. One mode is the interactive mode, where you can try commands, try things, and play with the commands you want for your production environment later. But we also have scripting mode where you can use the CLI, for example, in Python, in PowerShell, in Bash, whatever language you want, right, to create your automation scripts or deployment scripts. So enough with the slides. Let's go to the demo and see it in action.
And you may catch on to a common theme here. Our goal is to do live demos for the majority of the session today, very few slides.
Yeah. So first, let's take the CLI command that sets the mode to interactive view. Okay? So I changed the mode to interactive using fab config set mode interactive. Then I need to log in. Okay? So when I ask Fab to log in, it gives me a lot of options. I want to use the web browser, and I have cookies, so it will be silent login. But I can also check what is the user that is logging now. So I see that it's my user. Okay? So now you can see that I have the Fab here, which means that I am inside the interactive view. So let's start with file system commands. Let's start with ls, for example. With ls, I can see that I have 4 workspaces, okay? But I can also do ls-a, which means that I can see also hidden elements which are not there by default. For example, capacities, connections, domains, and so on. Right? And this command will work in all the layers. You always can do ls or ls-a. Okay? And you can also use the dir command, which works the same, basically. Now let's do something like this. Let's do ls for capacities. Okay? The thing is that when I run ls for capacities, I can see all the capacities that I have in the tenant as well, like that I have access to, right? And it works the same for domains. Okay? And again, here, what you can do also, let's do it this way. I can add flag for -l, which gives me more information about the capacities, like, for example, the capacity IDs and so on. It's always an API call, so sometimes there is a latency until I get the result. Okay? Okay, you can see here that I don't have access. Okay, so maybe I don't have access to some of the information that I can get with the -l command. And actually, that's why it took time. Okay, but let's try something else. Let's try ls-l for the current context, which is the workspaces. And then I should get all the workspaces with all the IDs and the capacity assignments and so on. So let's see what else I can do. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to show you how admins can use these commands. Okay. So let's go to the default customer templates workspace. And what I can do, I can go for it just with the cd command, okay? And with this, I am now inside the workspace itself. So I can do also ls here to see what items I have in the workspace. And as an admin, I can also check what permissions are in the workspace. So I run the sel command, and I can see that there are 2 users inside this workspace, 1 admin and 1 member, okay? Now what I want to do is I want to change this user, the second user, and make it an admin. So I can just do sel set, and I give this ID, which is here, an admin role. Yes, and now I can do the sl command again, and I can see that the second user is now is an admin in the workspace. So that's how also we can use that for governance, basically, right? Okay, so now what I want to show also is how we can use the Fabric CLI to onboard a new customer. For example, if you are an ISV and you have customers, and each time a new customer comes, you want to deploy a new workspace to bring the data in, and so on. So let's say how it works. So first, I want to go to the root again. And now I want to run a 𝗦𝗽𝗲𝗀. It's a simple file system command to create a workspace. And I select a capacity with -p capacity name. And now a new workspace is created. So I can go to that workspace using the cd command, right? And I can run the ls here to see that it's empty. It's just the workspace that I created right now. Now I want to create a lakehouse. So again, I run the 𝗦𝗽𝗲𝗀 command for lakehouse. And it's only with the .lakehouse I say that it's the artifact type. With a .workspace, I say it's a workspace that I want to create. So it's so simple. I created a lakehouse. Now let's try to open that lakehouse in the browser. So I can just run the open command, and it just opened the lakehouse in the browser. Okay, and it's empty lakehouse because it's brand new. Okay, now what I want to do also, I want to use the copy command, okay, to copy a notebook from a template workspace to the current workspace, okay? So I use the copy command, I'm sure, and it starts to copy the notebook from one workspace to the other, okay? Now, let's just open the notebook, the same. With open command, I can just open the notebook that I just created. Now, let's navigate back to the workspace. And what you will see that I just copied the notebook. I created a lakehouse, but that notebook still references the lakehouse from the template workspace, right? So let's do one thing. Let's go back to the lakehouse that I created. And I want to just rebind the notebook to the new lakehouse that I created, right? So let's take the IDs of the workspace and the lakehouse. And I prepared here a command where I want to set the default lakehouse for that notebook to point to the new lakehouse that I created. So this is the workspace ID. And I will take also the lakehouse ID. You can also take them from the CLI itself, right, with the ls-l command. So I will put the IDs here, and I will take this command and run it here. And it will start rebinding the notebook to the new lakehouse, basically. So if I go now to the lineage view again and refresh the page, I should see now that the lineage changed and the notebook is pointing to the right lakehouse for that customer. Okay? Now, let's move on. So we need to bring some data into that lakehouse, right? So what we need to do is basically to run a job which brings the data into the lakehouse. And for that, I want to just using job run and give it the notebook name. So all from the CLI, I can just run a job, and this job will start running immediately, right? And also, we will just do a polling in the CLI to see what's the status of this job. So we see that now it's in progress, and in a few moments, it will finish, and the data will be there inside the lakehouse.
This is actually a great example of what I was talking about earlier about APIs versus CLI, where this is one command to call the API, whereas in the reality, this probably is 15 to 20 lines of code if you had to interact directly with the APIs because of the polling mechanism required.
Okay, and you can see here that I ran like several commands, one after the other, in order to onboard a new customer, basically, to my app, right? And this is where scripting comes in. So you basically can create a PowerShell script or a bash script or even a Azure DevOps pipeline that just use the CLI with one command after the other to just with one click to onboard a new customer. okay, the job is finished. So now we want to go to the lakehouse and to check if the data is there and if the table is there, right? So let's do dir again. Let's move into the lakehouse using the CLI. And now what we want to do is ls here again inside the lakehouse. And I see that the lakehouse itself has files, has tables, and table maintenance. So I need to see like what are inside the tables view, right? So what I can do is I can just do ls tables, right? And I see that it has now a new table which has the filtered public holidays to the specific customer. Okay, and what you can do also with the CLI, you can browse the table itself. You can browse the table schema, for example, right? So I don't remember the command itself. Let's say I don't remember. What I can just do help, and I see that I have the table command here, right? So with help, you don't need to go back to the wiki or something. Just run the help command. And I can just do, let's do it again here. So ls, I have the tables, ls tables. I have a table name. And then I want to do table. And here also I want to do -h. And I can see that the table itself supports a loading data, schema, vacuum, and so on. So I want to do a table schema. And I want to provide the table name. Oh, the lakehouse name. Okay, sorry.
I think you need to step into the folder first.
Yeah. I need to go into the table folder first, and then
Proof also, this is a live demo.
Yeah. 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 So I need to go to the tables first, and then I want to bring the schema for the table itself. Okay? And actually, I actually don't remember the command. So I can show you how I can work without remembering the specific command. So we see the command, we see the table, we see the schema, and that's beautiful. We see how we can use the interactive mode in order to do one command after the other. I want to show you another demo where we can use scripting for smart things. Okay? So I prepared a demo for you where I can develop on the local machine and do incremental deployment of the things that I develop. Okay? So I will start with cloning the workspace that we just created, the customer B, into my local machine. So this is the script. It's export workspace PowerShell. And if I go to that script, it's not a long script, but it's basically what it does. It runs the fab export command. It takes the workspace name, and it takes the items path folder, and it exports the whole workspace into that folder. So if you see here, I got the items folder, and I got the notebook that we cloned before. Okay? So this is one thing. The other thing that this script does, it calculates hashes of all the directories that I cloned, and it stores the files hash and the directory hash inside a hashes file. Now what I want to do is I want to show you what can happen now with the import changes. So I want to run import changes for the customer B workspace. And I see that there is no changes at all. Okay? No changes at all. Now what I want to do, I want to go to the notebook. This is the notebook. And let's just make a small change here. Let's say, okay, it's United States. And save. Now, when I saved, I can go back to the demo, and I can do import changes. And now it understands that the notebook has changed because the directory hash has changed, and then the notebook is imported into the workspace. So this is another example of how you can use the Fabric CLI to do, like just use your imagination and you build whatever you want with that, right? Last thing, not all the APIs today are supported in the CLI, but we are extending this like every month, basically. But what if like you want to use an API that is not there yet? So what you can do, basically, you can use the fab API command. So let's show you this one. For example, I have here a Python file that uses the fab API command to connect the workspace to Git. Okay? So let's just run this Python file. So I will just run Python demo connect to Git. Sorry, Python. Okay, and it needs a workspace ID to connect that to Git. So let's go and bring the workspace ID again. And now it will start connecting the workspace to Git using the fab API command, right? And if I go back to the workspace and refresh, I should see that the workspace is connected to Git. You can see the source control button here. Okay, so this is an example where an API, which is not part of the CLI yet, but I can just use it from the CLI. And also we can see here the example that I used. One time I used Python, one time I used PowerShell. Back to you, Jacob.
Perfect. All right, one thing that we forgot to mention is all of the code that we shared today will also be in a GitHub repository after, so don't feel like you have to take screenshots and all of that. We will upload everything afterwards. Let's take it back to the slides. Okay, shifting gears a little bit. We talked tooling, we talked automation, let's talk CICD. CICD is near and dear to my heart, so I'm happy to be here. So let's set kind of the base of what we care about in CICD and Fabric. We have the concept of a workspace. We have the concept of items. We need to get those items into source control so that we can actually manage them. Today, source control supports 80% of the total Fabric items that we have and is quickly accelerating. The source providers that we support, Azure DevOps, GitHub, and GitHub Enterprise. And the most important piece about any sort of source controlling solution is APIs. As we actually just saw earlier, APIs are built throughout the Git integration solution, and service principal support, actually we'll touch on a little bit of new things coming in a second. Service principal support is an expectation by default. So some of the new things coming, at FabCon we actually announced that service principal support for GitHub was supported. We're excited to share that now Azure DevOps is also supported for SPNs. In addition to that, in the Azure DevOps world, cross-tenant authentication is now supported. Or when I say now supported, I'm saying June, so in the next month or so. The key there with cross-authentication is you can think about maybe you're a customer that has tenant A, B, and C, and you need to be able to integrate across both of those, but maybe your directory default sits in A. Really opens kind of the door to that world that we need. Schedulers is really important. Today, it is not possible to deploy a scheduler. So you can think about, you've created this beautiful solution. You can deploy everything from dev to test to prod. And now when you get into production, what now? I have to physically click a button? That's silly. So scheduler support is coming. It will be a part of the source control definition. So you will see it in source control, and it will be deployed with the items. And last but not least, something that was announced a little bit ago, but we just want to highlight it again, workspace folders. So workspace folders is not a concept of like outside of Fabric. You can think about those as subfolders within the workspace themselves. Those will appear within source control. They will also be deployed through deployment pipelines. They will be deployed through the APIs. So you can think about, man, I have that workspace that hits that 10,000 workspace item cap, and I can't find anything. Now at least you can organize those items. Variable libraries. Parameterization is key in CICD. Before variable libraries, it was honestly pretty hard to automate your solution because you had to inject all these parameters outside of the solution. Variable libraries is that solve. The goal here is to create an item that you can support environment-specific values. So you can think about that as my SQL Server connection in dev is this, my SQL Server connection in test is this, etc. The other key here is that it is a centralized management within Fabric. You're not leaving Fabric to go do anything and define your parameterizations outside of the tool. It is all a first-party experience. And the variable types supported today are kind of those basic, string, date, time, integer, etc. But it will expand pretty broadly soon. When we announced this at FabCon, it was only supported in data pipelines. However, as of today or in the next couple of weeks, Lakehouse with shortcuts will be supported. We'll actually demo that live today to prove it's real. And same with notebooks. Notebooks are coming in the July timeframe. So you can start to see how things are accelerating pretty quickly on that CICD story. CICD is really important to Microsoft Fabric in order to unblock those enterprise scenarios. Starting with data pipelines, lakehouses, and notebooks is only just the start, right? We expect this to be a first-party product throughout the entire platform and is something that you're frankly relying on for your parameterization and not trying to figure out how do I do something outside of the tool. Near and dear to my heart, so my team actually supports an open source library called Fabric CICD. It is a Python library. My team has been developing on top of Fabric for about the last 3 years or so. It was about 1.5 years ago that we realized that there was a pretty big gap in our ability to deploy before the product had caught up to where it really needed to. We developed an internal library at that point, and decided, I think it was about 6 or 9 months ago, there was a lot of value in opening this up to the community. The goal here is not to be a replacement for anything in tool, but instead to be a wrapper on top of existing capabilities to jumpstart your ability to deploy. You can leverage this library within Azure DevOps and GitHub Actions. You can create environment-specific parameterization. Now, you may question, how is that different than variable libraries? Well, we did just talk about variable libraries that's supported in 3 items. What about the other 25 or however many we actually have? So it's kind of a better together story for now until variable libraries gets to that full support. And most important is we expect to have full parity with the APIs and source control. We don't want to be yet another, hitch of, oh, well, Fabric CICD only supports this, I need this. A great example, at FabCon, we didn't support any of the item types on the right-hand side. That was about 2.5 months ago. We now support all of the key RTI scenario item types: event house, event stream, KQL database, KQL query set, activator. Copy job, not really RTI, but we might as well throw that one in there. Now, a bit of a plug to the open source community. We also didn't support data warehouses until last Friday. Last Wednesday, somebody reached out and said, hey, why don't we have data warehouses? We said, we don't have it because we haven't built it yet. What do you think about building it yourself? And on Friday, we had data warehouse support. It is really that easy to accelerate these. And the key there is to think about open source is, we're a community building together. We can't do anything different than what you can do. If there's something that you want to build into the tool, let's do it together and we can accelerate some CI/CD scenarios. Another great example of an open source contribution is the key value parameterization. The text is a little bit small, but in the parameterization world, we essentially support find, replace strings. So look for this GUID and replace this GUID. There was an opportunity to say, well, we have JSON and we have YAML that operate in proper key value combinations, and therefore we can actually replace things based off of the keys. So that was actually recently brought into Fabric CI/CD as well. On a quick roadmap, once scheduler is brought in, because my team also uses Fabric CI/CD for all of our internal deployments of our own analytics solution, I need this on day one. So that will be a top priority for us as soon as it is available. Now, most important, let's do some live demos. Actually, I forgot I had another slide. So what are we doing in the demo? To think about this demo, you can think about it as we are going to take something from inception through to our lowest environment through to production. So we're going to create a feature branch. We're going to sync that feature branch to an existing, to a Fabric workspace. We're going to make changes and commit that back to our feature branch. Then we're going to merge that into dev, our lowest branch. Then we're going to use the sync to get feature. What we chatted about a little bit ago was the support for ADO SPNs on the APIs. So you'll notice here that we're not going to click any buttons to do this. This is going to be through the automation of the APIs. Then we're going to cherry pick to production, our production branch. And then we're going to use Fabric CICD to do that final deployment. Now, the key with all of this is not a reference architecture. This is not, you can only do it in dev and prod. This could be 4 or 5 or 10 environments. We only have so much time, so we're gonna choose 2 today. Perfect. Let's log in my computer. Alrighty. Okay, so to set the foundation here, we're not going to focus a lot on, it's essentially what Ali did of, I'm going to show you moving data and all of that. Our focus here is on the CI/CD scenario. So in the real production world, I would expect, if I compared this even to my own production workspace, maybe a couple hundred, 300 or 400 items that we expect to deploy. If we even look in the notebooks here, I have one. It's not a real-world example, but the goal is the CI/CD story. So what we've built here is a pretty typical metadata orchestration flow. You can see that we're using a lookup activity to reference a storage of some sort. It could be SQL Server, it could be Fabric SQL, it could be DW, et cetera. Could even be a lakehouse. The goal there is that we have a location outside of Fabric that we need to reference to pull in essentially the values that we want to execute with some parameters. Once we have those values, we're going to convert those names to IDs. One of the critical things that we need to consider with the CI/CD scenario is we don't necessarily think about things in terms of IDs because IDs are associated to a specific workspace. So if you hard code IDs in your metadata orchestration, well, good luck getting to the next environment. So we're going to leverage some of the existing APIs to actually convert those names using the context of the workspace and the name to get the associated ID. We'll dynamically pass that into the notebook. And then, of course, near and dear to my heart, or at least the folks on my team in live site, if it's in production, we probably should let somebody know if it failed. Now, there are some obvious inefficiencies with the approach that we have here. We're using the workspace ID as a way to define what environment we're in. The obvious problem here is if everything blows up tomorrow, I have to refactor all of my code in order to support actually redeploying everything. I can't simply just take what I have in source control and click deploy. The other issue here is this is considering a 2-environment concept. So we have dev and prod. Well, what if we have dev, test, and prod? I obviously can't use an is production flag anymore to do the same operations. It's further compounded to say, okay, now I'm hard coding operations, the operations DB here, and I'm hard coding the operations server. Some clear inefficiencies, right? And again, when we talk about, okay, what if tomorrow my operations server changes to ABC instead of 1, 2, 3? And I have this referenced in 20 different pipelines. It doesn't scale. The key of the variable library concept is to enable that scale, to essentially offload a lot of this to a centralized location that we can leverage. So I've done a little bit of the legwork on the variable library. You can see that we've defined an operations DB. We've defined the dev and the prod instance of that. You can actually notice here that this indication tells you that the value is different between the 2 environments. If we had, say, dev test prod or dev uat prod, you would expect to see another alternative set here as well. So we've defined operations DB, operations server, and is production. One of the cool things to call out with this is production is that it is of type Boolean, which means that we don't need to do any sort of translation in our downstream system to actually interpret those values. The other thing that we mentioned earlier about variable libraries supporting specific data types, some of the things that maybe can come soon is, well, what about references to other items or other data types, et cetera? This will only accelerate over time. So then in the pipeline world, we have the variable concept, which we should be at least somewhat familiar with. We now have the library variable concept as well. We're going to define, wow, you know what? I realized that I forgot to branch out. So let's branch out real quick, and then we can get back to where we were. Branch out to another workspace. The good news is if I tried to do any sort of commits, it would have rejected me because I don't have permissions, so that's great. So we're going to choose an existing workspace. One of the things that we actually announced at FabCon was the ability to branch out to an existing workspace instead of a new workspace. The cool thing here is by branching out to an existing workspace, there's kind of an assumption or a base understanding that you probably already have some of the items you already need in that workspace. And therefore, if you say I have 100 items and there's 100 notebooks and 2 of them have changed since the last time you made a modification, well, we actually get to save some of that compute. We don't have to necessarily recalculate everything and rehydrate everything. We're going to rehydrate the diff. You'll notice actually by the time I finish talking there, we're already synced into that workspace. Let's close out of these ones just to make sure I don't make a change directly in dev. Good thing we weren't in production. All right, so let's go back to the run notebooks. And we're going to make some modifications here. Actually, need to create those variables first. So we have the isProduction flag. Again, if we were talking about a dev test prod, you probably wouldn't want to leverage something like this. Although for the scenario of isProduction of raising an ICM, it's a great example of please don't send me an email in dev when my developer has made a mistake. So isProduction, you'll notice again type bool is being respected here. Operation server. And operations DB. Perfect. Now we can go back to where we should have been. And we can start replacing those references. You'll notice that the references are very similar to inserting a parameter or a variable. It should feel natural to you to reference a variable library as well. And because we changed the connection, we obviously need to update the table that it needs to pull from. Okay. And then the last thing is that isProduction flag. Now, my favorite thing as a developer, deleting technical debt. Let's delete all the variables that we don't need. Save this. And now we obviously have a much simpler pipeline. We don't have all of the variables being defined within the pipeline, and that means it's something that can be managed locally. So this at least brings us to what we had at FabCon. Now let's shift gears and talk about some of the new advancements coming in the notebook world. In the notebook world, it's pretty common to have some sort of shared function library or shared function notebook where you're managing things that need to execute in every notebook. This example here is how we're authenticating to ADLS Gen 2, or in the example of Fabric, it could be a Fabric Lakehouse. We're also managing some connections as well at the bottom. So you'll notice that the approach is very similar to what we have to do in the pipeline world. We have to physically hard code some workspace ID to at least set the context of where we are. Actually, in my production scenario before variable libraries, we had, if dev, if test, if prod, if feature branch, et cetera. The list goes on, right? So we're using this to define the environment of production or non-production. And a common example, at least for our scenario, is interacting with key vault. We obviously have a production key vault and a non-production key vault, and we need to keep those isolated. Tenant ID, maybe not a great example, but you'll see actually how this is really helpful in a little bit here. Then on the connection side, you can see that we're using the environment to define a dynamic path. So one thing that you may not have known in the lakehouse world is you can actually use the friendly names of lakehouses with the ABFSS path. You just need to specify the lakehouse.lakehouse. What this allows us to do is to construct some dynamic strings based off of, if you have standard naming conventions of your different workspaces, you can start to manipulate that. So even outside of the variable library, this is a really good tip of, how do you manage CI/CD at scale? So for the connection side, let's start there to say, how do we solve for connections in Fabric notebooks using a similar construct to what we already looked at? So we have this concept of the unified default lakehouse changes between dev and prod. All of the other ones are exactly the same. Now we need to solve for the key vault side of it and the tenant IDs and the environment concepts that we were talking about. We're going to create some new variables. So as I mentioned, one of the values of variable libraries is not just its ability to define environment-specific values, but also to leverage it for global variables. So in the example where the tenant ID for Microsoft is always going to be the same tenant ID for Microsoft, however, I might need that in a data function, I might need it in a pipeline, and I might need it in a notebook. You don't need to define those things separately. You can define them globally, even actually a little bit beyond kind of what we had in the Azure world where you were still scoped to a single resource. Here, we can define one variable that we can reference in all of our items. So the key vault URL is going to seem pretty similar to the operations DB of dev versus prod. And then we're going to go save it. And let's go back into the notebook. So let's see how we can change this. Let's make it a little bit cleaner. So in notebooks, there is a new method of variable libraries.getVariables. What this does is returns a variable library object. You can then access the variables within using the dot notation. So in this example, vl.keyvaultURL is accessing the variables within that specific variable library. Next, on the connection side, we can do something similar. So we have VL connection, which is creating a variable library object for the connection library. And you'll notice how much cleaner this is. As a developer, if I can make anything shorter, it's a great day. But this also allows you to start thinking about things in terms of like abstraction, of moving that from something that a developer needs to worry about to something that we can manage centrally and combined. Now, let's go ahead again, one of my favorite things, let's delete some things. And to prove it's working, let's run it. So we already saw what values we should expect in here. We're in a feature branch, and therefore we should be expecting the dev values to come out of it.
Yeah, note that these variables work in runtime mode, which means that if I change the variables, they are immediately affected in the notebook.
And actually, we may have been struck by the demo gods. It looks like the session is not starting in the expected 10 seconds. So we're going to switch over to lakehouses real quick, and we'll come back here and see if it actually resolved. So shortcuts is another really common scenario we have. Like, it's one of those pillar propositions of why you should use Fabric, of, well, you don't have to move your data, you can use shortcuts. Until today, well, if you used a shortcut, good luck trying to deploy that in dev, test, and prod. Again, we're trying to unblock those core scenarios of when I deploy something, I need the values to change. A shortcut is one of those things that's pretty difficult to use or to change because we don't have any context to what you actually want to change it to. In the example of, say, a pipeline referencing a lakehouse, and they're in the same workspace, we can make that assumption that when we move to test and prod, well, we're obviously going to move it to the next environment with you. When you're referencing something like a lakehouse outside of your workspace, we don't want to make any assumptions along the way, so we need deep parameterization to support that. One of the items recently announced was the ability to manage shortcuts. By managing shortcuts, that now unblocks the scenario of being able to make modifications to those shortcuts. So you can see here that we define a target workspace and a target item. So you can think about that as the lakehouse ID is the target item. The target workspace is then the lakehouse workspace ID. In the general library, our general variable library that we created, you can see we've already defined a storage workspace ID and a storage lakehouse ID. So then we're going to go to target workspace, storage workspace ID, and then we'll choose the lakehouse ID as well. You'll notice that there is an interesting syntax here. So this is syntax that you will see across the board in Fabric for references to variable libraries. And this is actually what we'll see in source control as well, of how we know what we're pointing to. So then we're going to click a new button called Update All Variables. What this is going to do is propagate those values so that it's properly reflected in the lakehouse. Okay, and let's see if that notebook ran. Well, I don't think it's going to run today. That's okay. We'll test it again in production when we try to prove it out there. All right, so now we can close out the items. We've effectively finished our light feature branching, concept that we want to do here. Now we can see that we have 4 items that we modified. We have that lakehouse with the new shortcut that's referencing the variable library. We have the run notebooks that's updated that connection of definition. The run notebook is the metadata orchestration. The util shared is the notebook. And variable libraries, we've obviously updated some of the values within. Let's go ahead and commit all of these. And now moving to what I thought was going to be the most risky part of the demo is actually doing a deployment. What we will do now is we'll create some pull requests. Call this build 2025. And as we can see, the values have been updated, and the only things that have been changed are what we would have expected to change. Let's blindly approve this, developer best practice. And at the same time, we're going to cherry pick to production.
Yeah, one thing to note here that all the variables with all the values in dev test prod are also in Git. So you can also change these values in source control and do a pull request for them. You can see the files in the left side there. We have the prod.json and the values.json.
Okay. So we've completed the dev, and let's also complete the prod. Again, blind approval, why not? Production is production, right? The goal here is we want to kick off those build pipelines because obviously they're going to take a couple minutes to spin up the VMs and actually do the deployment. Now that we've kicked that off, let's show you what it's doing, right? That's probably the most important part and why we're all here. So we've defined a very basic YAML structure to deploy from Azure DevOps. You can think about it as, defining the Python version we want to use, installing Fabric CICD. You'll see why we're using Fabric CICD in a second. And then we're making a basic if statement of if we're in dev, do something. If we're in prod, do something different. As I mentioned before, when we're in dev, we just want to sync the branch. We don't want to actually do a full deployment. We want to leverage the capabilities within Fabric. Then when we move to production, we want to do a full deployment, which means we're not connected directly to the workspace from the branch. We're going to deploy into the workspace. Just to show kind of like a better friendly syntax, because it is YAML, doesn't show quite as well. We're going to execute a sync fabric workspace py file, which we'll look at in a second, in dev. And we're passing in a workspace name of Helix Dev Engineering. This is where we can start to think about, well, how could I scale this even further? If I want to reuse this for 20 or 30 different deployments, you can think about offloading this to maybe a variable group within Azure DevOps to manage that locally or centrally as well. Then on the production side, we're going to call deploy fabric workspace.py. So sync fabric workspace. Bear with me, there is a little bit of API calls that we're making here to make it work. The first thing that we're doing is we're initializing a target workspace. The target workspace here, we're actually using Fabric CI/CD under the hood to do this, purely because of the simplicity of interacting with the authentication methods. You could actually use the same thing with CLI, or you could actually just execute the REST APIs directly. There's really no difference here. You can think about it as we're shortcutting the ability to get that bearer token. Then we're going to update our credentials in Fabric. So this essentially is a handshake between Fabric and my SPN to say, trust me, I trust you, let me deploy. And then we're going to resolve the heads. So we have a head that's been defined within the workspace, and we have a commit head that's been defined within the branch. We need to pass both of those into the sync so that it can understand, okay, what do you want me to do? Where do you want me to sync from and to? And last but not least, we'll actually call the sync command. The key for the sync command is the prefer remote. This means that we're going to ignore anything within the workspace and always overwrite what's in the branch. Now when we move to the production scenario, it actually starts to look a little bit cleaner. Again, as I mentioned from the Fabric CI/CD side, our goal there was to deliver something as little lines of code as possible to allow you to deploy. The top is effectively the same, where we're defining the arguments that you need to pass in. You're defining a target workspace, and all you need to do is define or to call publish all items and call unpublish orphan items. You can think about that as build up and build down. We're going to deploy everything that's in your branch, and then we're going to look at the diff between what's been deployed and what is in your branch to then remove items in the proper order so that after a deployment, what you expect to be there is there. Now, we touched on parameterization and at least what's supported within Fabric CI/CD. Variable libraries isn't going to support everything on day one. So we still need some level of deep parameterization within Fabric CI/CD to support all of those edge case scenarios. A more basic scenario that Ali actually mentioned earlier was the definition of a default lakehouse. So within Fabric CI/CD, you can define the lakehouse I expect for this notebook, or even you can do item name and define a specific lakehouse name, et cetera, that you want to modify. Now, the nuance is more so on the Spark Pool side. For Spark Pools, it's a little bit more complex. If you define Spark Pools in a feature branch, but it's not the same Spark Pool that's in your dev or your test or your prod branch. So you need to be able to parameterize that as well. Now that we have ran through the scripts, in theory, our deployments should be done. Love to see green. All right, so if we go into dev, we should see run notebooks should now have no references or additional set variables. That's a key of the deployment, right? It worked. The util shared notebook should also, look as we expected. Looks good. You'll notice we also have the proper folders that are in there. And if we go to the storage lakehouse, we can also see the shortcut should be pointed to a variable library. Cool, so git sync is working, that's great. Now let's move into that production deployment scenario as well. Now, one thing I didn't mention is, well, why do we care about DevOps and why are we going through all this effort? I can just click the sync button. The reality there is most development scenarios is not going to do what we talked about today. You're going to have some sort of build process on top of that. You're going to have some sort of release process. You're probably also going to isolate this into a build and release job, right? There's a lot more capabilities that come along with just the basics of can I deploy? All right, so now that we're in production, again, we should see the same exact thing. Love to see it. If I go to my notebook, let's see if we can get this session started up to prove that it actually is working as well. Let's see. And while that's running, let's just prove again that the storage lakehouse looks as we should. Uh-oh. Looks like I found a bug. Well, the good news is Fabric CICD has not actually bumped their version yet. This was working in the last deployment earlier today, so we'll have to resolve that. No big deal. And the notebook is not running. So, as a follow-up to this session, I will share you the live code that actually works. Session start times are a little bit finicky in the lower environment. We are actually not in a production environment here, so bear with us. I will take it back to some of the content we have and say, okay, that's great. We just ran through a pretty script-heavy solution. What if I don't want to do that? What if I want low code? It's okay as a developer to also want low code. I just want that to be well known and aware. There is a concept within Fabric called deployment pipelines. You can think about this as a low code solution to elevate your code from one branch to another. You can think about this similar to what we were chatting about earlier of you can have 2 environments or you could have 10 environments. Doesn't really matter. It's up to you. Similarly, it supports the same item types that we talked about on the API and the source control side. And last but not least, Fabric APIs, again, throughout. The expectation there is that you should be able to do anything with an API that you can do with a button click. On the roadmap side, automation tooling in CICD is very important to Microsoft Fabric and is a top priority for Microsoft. On the CICD front, you can see Dataflow Gen 2 is coming soon for variables. New item types, item references, and connection references. You can think about that as I'm connecting a notebook to a lakehouse, but I also want that to be dynamic. Instead of using the GUIDs, why don't we use the connections that were already defined? GA for variable library. Sensitivity labels and item definitions, that's another really big one. I don't know if your organization is similar to ours. Oops. But our organization default sensitivity labels is not something we can actually deploy. So really critical that we get those into source control. .NET SDKs are coming. Python SDK, again, near and dear to my heart. Glad to see that coming. On the dev tool side, a lot of updates coming on CLI. One of the biggest ones to call out is OSS. Open source is critical to our acceleration to make sure that we are reaching the developer community, which also means that we need you to also contribute, right? If there's an idea that you have and the capacity isn't there for the team to build it, well, you have all the tools and resources to build it yourself. With that, Fabric is one click away. Trials are available, for any user that wants to try it out. It's as simple as a click to get a capacity started. If there are any questions, I will be at the Ask the Experts booth tomorrow between 11:30 and 3. I also will have some time, or we will have some time afterwards if we want to chat. Please do provide feedback for the session. It's really critical so that we can learn and grow. Maybe don't provide feedback on the things that didn't work. We'll work on that. And as I mentioned, GitHub specifically, we will have a repository so that you can actually execute all of the code that we shared today. We intentionally built it so that you could take it to your tenant and make a couple of modifications and actually do the same deployments. A couple more resources and related sessions. Take a quick picture there. There's a lot of awesome sessions coming up. Again, the resource on the left-hand side, you can go to the prior QR code to get all of that as well. And with that, I ended right at 0 seconds, so I don't know if that was perfect or not, but thank you all very much, and have a good rest of build.
Thank you.